Chapter 42. The Duel. Why, I will fight with him upon this theme until my eyelids will no longer wag. Hamlet, Act 5, Scene 1. We were walking under the luxuriant foliage. At a distance, the granite tower of Thaumaturge loomed above the trees. A dim light glimmered through the casement. Voices were heard announcing the arrival of the royal party in the garden. Footsteps rapidly approached. Someone touched me on the shoulder. I turned, and Prince Jrny stood before me, his features distorted with passion. "A word with you," he said. "I am at your Highness's leisure," I replied. "You refused the toast offered by Duke Cymbarite." "And you refused the toast offered by me." "As the Prince of Royal Blood, I have the right to refuse any toast I please." "As a citizen of the United States of America, I have the same right." "Your refusal was an insult." "You may take it as you please." "I demand an instant apology." "And I refuse." "What? Do you dare?" You have refused to apologize for your insult to my honored host, Duke Altheon, and my friend, Prince Altafora, and the Princess Mandal Ultima thoroughly despises you." Lord Montalban stood appalled. Jrny grew almost black in the face. For an instant was speechless with rage, and then hissed out, "Ha! This to me, you despicable adventurer, hanger-on of that court?" "Certainly, right to your face. And now I announce the ultimatum of Prince Harovian that he'll not stoop to cross swords with you, but will post for you for a coward and a poltroon, and whip you wherever he can lay his hands on you, which castigation would be eminently appropriate to your case, and give me much pleasure to witness." With a roar more like that of a wild beast than a human being, he struck me a blow in the face, drew his rapier, and rushed on me. I sprang back, whipped out my sword, and for the first time in history of this planetary system, the clash of steel resounded between denizens of different worlds. The nobles rushed forward, several with drawn weapons, evidently bent on attacking me. "Stand back, my lords!" exclaimed Colonel Armatov sternly, drawing his rapier. "The insult and blow have passed. His Royal Highness and Lieutenant Hamilton stand on equal ground. I will allow no interference here." As the colonel was an acknowledged authority on all matters appertaining to the code of honor, and, furthermore, as he was known to be one of the most formidable swordsmen in the army, their lordships evidently concluded that discretion was the better part of valor, and drew back. Besides, it was evident that the majority rather wished the threatened combat to go on. After the first clash, the prince and I lowered our weapons and stepped back several paces. The nobles approached and whispered to him. He nodded acquiescence. One of them, who might have found his terrestrial counterpart in Sir Lucas O'Trigger, and who rejoiced in the title of Captain Swaggerchop, stepped towards me with a toss of his head. "His Highness consents to waive his royal prerogative of refusing passage at arms with a foreigner, an inferior, and condescends to give Lieutenant what's-his-name full satisfaction. Lieutenant Hamilton has heard the oration of Captain what-d'ye-call-him, and consents to give his Highness ditto," I replied. It was evident that the prince was desirous of displaying his courage and accomplishments before his friends, and showing them how easily he could lay out the despicable adventurer. "Ha! I shall take my pleasure in giving this pet of Mandal Ultima a few lessons in fence, and cool his blood a little." The lords expressed immense satisfaction at the prospect of a little bloodletting. The preliminaries were quickly arranged. The prince chose Captain Swaggerchop as his second. Colonel Armatov politely offered his services to me, which I thankfully accepted. The prince and I were about the same height, and in that respect the chances seemed about equal. His rapier, a magnificent weapon, was a little longer than my naval sword, and lighter in weight, but I waived the difference. We threw off our coats. A handkerchief was bound around the wrist, and this most graceful, elegant, and in all respects most satisfactory mode of adjusting personal grievances was begun. The Martian style of fence is quite different from ours, and its various movements of avance, lunge, rencontre, feinte, engage, etc., puzzled me. My antagonist was an expert swordsman, had few superiors among the maîtres d'armes in his kingdom, and handled his rapier with consummate skill. For some time I confined myself to the defensive, parrying his thrusts and studying his mode of attack. To my surprise and perplexity, the blade of his rapier was elastic as whalebone and flexible as rubber, and had a thick coil around my own, and creeping up over the handle in its very serpentine fashion, and wounded me in the wrist. Twice I received its insidious thrust on the arm. Once I succeeded in getting inside his guard and planting a powerful stroke on his breast, which made him stagger, but to my astonishment, instead of wounding him, as I fully expected, my blade bounced back as if it had struck a rock. This was a great mystery to me. I now determined on another mode of tactics, in which I had been regarded as rather expert, namely disarming. It is a dangerous maneuver, requiring more than usual skill and strength, and unless accomplished neatly and expeditiously, renders the assailant liable to be run through by his antagonist. Parrying a fierce lunge, I sprang forward, locked my hilt with his, and with a swift motion twisted it out of his hand and hurled it into a distance. The prince turned pale, threw up his hands, wheeled about, and retreated. "Ho there, your Royal Highness," shouted Colonel Armatov. "Shall I have the pleasure of announcing to your regiment that you acknowledge yourself conquered?" "By no means," said I, lowering my sword. "Captain Swaggerchop will have the kindness to restore the rapier to his Highness." The lord stared at me with open-mouthed stupefaction, such an act of courtesy on the part of a victor at sword being unheard of in this kingdom. Swaggerchop picked up the rapier and handed it to the prince, who received it trembling. "Splendidly done, Lieutenant," said Colonel Armatov to me. "This is the first time His Highness was ever disarmed," murmured the lords. "Pooh," I said, "any ensign in our navy can do that." Divajar's face grew dark with rage as Swaggerchop adjusted the handkerchief to his wrist more securely. "The fellow has a wrist of iron," muttered he with a fierce oath. It was evident that the prince and lords were much impressed and somewhat alarmed by my maneuver. A prolonged whispering took place, during which they closely surrounded him. He seemed to be adjusting something around his waist, under his dress. Colonel Armatov became impatient. "Is your Royal Highness ready?" he asked. The lord stepped back. "Be on your guard. When you touch him, let fly," whispered Swaggerchop with a meaning look. Divajar answered with an equally meaning glance, then poised his weapon, advanced with a triumphant look to meet my assault. He was now more wary, so was I. The mutual engages were given and received with great caution. But in spite of all that I could do, that snaky rapier would crawl up my sword, wounding my wrist. It seemed to be endowed with a infernal life. Every stroke was like an electric shock, almost paralyzing my arm, and whenever I planted a stroke on him, my sword's point failed to penetrate. I got 3 powerful thrusts on his breast, which would have run through any other man, but although my weapon staggered him, it flew back as from a shield of iron. The combat now became furious. The loud clash and rattle of swords resounded among the trees. I was growing weak from loss of blood, and my arm was becoming paralyzed. My antagonist saw it, and a smile of malignant triumph wreathed his lips. I knew full well that my heart's blood would soon dye the green sward. Collecting all my remaining strength, I rushed with fierce onslaught, driving him back step by step. Suddenly his look turned from me and became fixed on some object over my head. An expression of terror came over his face. I beat up his weapon, sprang forward, grasped his sword in my left hand, and, with a powerful exertion of strength, hurled him to the ground. He grew ghastly pale. His eyes dilated as if some fearful vision had opened before him. He gave a smothered cry and sank insensible. I glanced around, and in the window of Thaumaturge's tower appeared what seemed the spirit of a beautiful young woman, clothed in the cerements of the tomb, her countenance expressing depths of anguish and despair. With disheveled hair and colorless lips, her eyes, glittering with the fires of madness, were fixed on the prostrate prince, while down her pale cheeks streamed tears of unutterable sorrow. For an instant only, this inexpressible sad vision gleamed before my eyes, then disappeared. The point of my sword hung over my antagonist's breast. The throng rushed forward with drawn weapons. "Stand back!" sternly commanded Colonel Armatov. "By the gods, whoever interferes, I'll run him through. The life of His Highness is forfeit. He must purchase it by full and ample apology to his antagonist. 'Tis the law of the code. I am sole arbiter here. Advance a single point, and the best of you shall breathe his last. The lords fell back. A sudden cry was heard, and a beautiful child, the very image of that sad vision, rushed from the trees, her long wavy hair streaming in the wind, fell on her knees before the prostrate man, clasped her arms around his neck, kissed him, then raising her innocent face to mine, her eyes filled with tears, and in touching tones, "Please, oh please, do not hurt my dear papa." I flung down my sword, and took the little one in my arms. "The Princess Alizona," whispered all, bowing with marked respect and removing their hats. The young princess threw her arms around my neck and kissed me on both cheeks. "Oh, you are so good. You would not hurt my dear papa. Now, please, promise, poor little Ali will love you so dearly." I caressed the child, giving my faithful promise. 2 elderly court ladies came quickly forward and bore her away, weeping and holding out her arms imploringly to the prostrate man. Suddenly a gigantic and meager figure, clad in somber black, glided from the trees and pushed through the throng. It was Thaumator. Stooping over the insensible prince, he tore open the waistcoat, and under the garments disclosed to our astonished gaze a complete suit of chain armor, sword, and bulletproof, investing his body, while around his waist was a belt containing a small but powerful electrical battery, communicating by a flexible wire along the arm and hand directly to the blade of the rapier. The paralyzing strokes I had received from the weapon of my antagonist were explained. "The devil!" murmured several. "Bless my soul! Who ever heard of such a thing?" queried the swells. "Very, very extraordinary," chirped the dudes. "Really, can't it be possible?" squeaked the weaklings. "Colonel Armatov," stammered Captain Swaggerchop, "we hope you'll not suspect us of any of us had any knowledge of her." "Huh!" sneered the colonel with unutterable contempt. "Me Lord Doge," dawdled the Grace Dandyprat. "We hope your Grace will permit us to say in behalf of the royal cousin—" "Bosh!" thundered the Duke. Thaumator strode amidst the throng, stooped, his colossal stature peering into the faces one by one with a look that Mephistopheles would have envied, uttering peculiar sounds, whether sneers, laughs, or applause none could interpret. They fell back as if Beelzebub himself was among them. Then, thrusting a scrap of paper in my hand, he strode swiftly to his tower. I looked around. A lift stood by my side, with a glance almost of pity on the prostrate man, and of haughty contempt on the lords, who looked as if they scarcely knew where to hide their heads. He took my arm, and accompanied by Lord Montabar and Duke Armatov, we entered the salon, while the prince rose from the ground shaking with impotent rage. His companions clustered around him, and all hurriedly left the grounds. A lift called an attendant, who applied a healing lotion to my wounds, which fortunately were only flesh deep, and skillfully bound them up. Duke Armatov now rose to bid us adieu. I expressed my sincere thanks for his courteous kindness to me. "Don't speak of it, my dear sir, I beg of you," he replied. "I shall be only too happy to render you any service in my power. I only regret, however, that you had not met a foeman worthy of your steel." Then turning to the minister, "I have decided to resign my commission in the army, and I beg your excellency's immediate acceptance." "But, my dear colonel—" "It is totally incompatible with my feelings of honor to remain any longer in the ranks with that royal caitiff," he replied indignantly. "The esprit de corps of the army is tarnished, stained, while that coward remains there." "I appreciate your feelings, but I cannot accept the resignation of one of our most distinguished officers, who has won such laurels and high renown on the fields. You're too highly appreciated, and your service too valuable to our kingdom," replied Ilif, warmly pressing his hand. "Well, then I have to desert, and you'll have to hang me. That is, provided you can catch me," replied the colonel with a grim smile and a merry twinkle in his eye as he left the room. The attendants departed. Lord Montabar bade us good night, and we retired to his apartment. Elif and I were left alone. I looked at the paper Thaumator had given me. Quote, "My very clever but somewhat unsophisticated young terrestrial friend, Lieutenant of the U.S.N., you are a right good fellow and a gallant fighter, but you are no match for H.R.H. Devoe, with his coat of mail and battery. one of his cheap tricks, and you would not have had a ghost of a chance against him had I not favored him with a ghostly vision which rather took the pluck out of him. It is lucky for you his rapier was not poisoned also. In the hurry of the affair he forgot that essential part of the business. Take my advice and get out of this part of the Martian world at once, and stand not on the order of your going. A word to the wise is sufficient. Thaumator. P.S. How stands the fortune-telling business up to date? Thaumator's prediction had come true to the letter so far, said Elif. You had the lively adventure, the temper of your sword and disposition have been tested, and you have had a pretty close call at Divajor's snaky rapier. But my honor has come out all right so far, I replied. Perhaps that test will come by and by. That's true. He advises me to get out of this kingdom. What shall I do? I should be very loath to deprive myself of your excellency's hospitality on any such imputation, and I should equally regret to lose the company of my honored guests. But there's the love affair, elopement, a married woman, injured husband, pistols, all bound to come. Great Scott! It strikes me the sooner I get out of this kingdom, the better. But that will not break the spell, replied Elif. They're all bound to come, wherever you are. In that case, I would rather take my chances among my friends than here. At this moment, 2 elderly female attendants entered with little Elysion. She ran to the minister with a cry of delight. He took her in his arms and, caressing her, then presented her to me. The poor child had entirely forgotten the event in which she had taken part. It was evident the faculty of memory was wanting or undeveloped. She was a beautiful child of 10 years, well grown and of exceedingly affectionate disposition. But her intellect seemed weak, and the expression of her countenance was of deep sadness, as if some great shock of terror or grief had fallen upon her in early childhood, and left its lasting impress on her mind. For a while she amused us with her childish prattle, then, affectionately kissing Elif, bade us good night, and departed with the attendants. That dear one is the only being left for me to love and cherish, he said in a sad voice. She is the child of my only daughter, who is the pride and joy of my home. Like a pure and innocent flower was she, one of the most lovely and accomplished of women, kind, the idol of my heart, who I guarded with jealous care. Secluded within the privacy of our home, she knew nothing of the world. By accident she met Prince Divajor, and long ere I dreamed of it, she had given her innocent heart into his keeping. Their meeting was by stealth, and he had employed all his arts of persuasion and cunning in which he was well skilled. My knowledge of this came too late. Her love was irrevocably fixed. They were united in marriage. He treated her most cruelly, broke her heart, and drove her to madness and death. The poor little one, the fruit of that union, has inherited the innocent, confiding, and sensitive nature of her mother, but her mind is clouded with the same deep melancholy, and she is often visited by the same dreadful terrors and illusions that closed the last years of her unfortunate mother's life. The unnatural father cares nothing for his child, as you can imagine how I feel towards him who has blighted 2 innocent lives. And the minister bowed his head and was almost overcome with grief. 'Twas the portrait of this wronged and suffering princess, now in her grave, Thaumator had taken from his master's apartment, placed in his window, and illuminated with a bright light, which struck terror, if not remorse, to Divajor's heart.